Hello everybody and welcome to this video where I explain my 15 chosen quotations from the Love and Relationships rap. So hopefully you've checked that out. You can follow the link in the description to go and watch that video. You can also download the rap for free on iTunes. But the idea was that I didn't want to help you memorize quotations if I didn't explain why they're so important. So that's what this video is about. What I tried to do was to choose quotations that had numerous lines of analysis, lots of different things you could say about them. So let me get right into it and explain some of the reasons I chose the quotations. Of course, they'll help with your own interpretations as well. In Love's Philosophy, I chose the quotation, "The sunlight clasps the earth and the moonbeams kiss the sea." This is from stanza 2. It's an example of personification, essentially saying that in nature things are united and together. Now, if you remember, this is the line of argument that is presented throughout the poem, where stanza 1 established how the fountains unite with the rivers, which in turn unite with the seas, and stanza 2 is much of the same. The waves clasp together, the sunlight clasps the earth, and ultimately it builds up to the final line of the stanza, which is the whole line of argument, "Why won't you kiss me?" This is a great poem because it's an example of personification where things that aren't human are doing things that are only human, like kissing. And it's also a great example of the imagery of nature. And structurally, it's a good piece of analysis because it's the continued line of argument presented again here in stanza 2. So lots of things you can say about it. In the Sing Song, I chose the quotation, "After we have made love like we rowing through Putney." Now this at first seems like quite a bizarre simile. It doesn't seem to make sense. How is making love to your wife similar to rowing through the London district of Putney? The rhyme seems forced in this stanza. The meaning is bizarre. The effect is comic. But the word Putney here is misunderstood. It's actually Punjabi for wife, where it makes much more sense in reference to lovemaking. Now what's happened here is really clever. Western readers are likely to misunderstand the cultural reference, symbolising how misunderstood the Indian population in Britain was and perhaps still is. And linking this to love and relationships, we can infer that there is a relationship between the first and second generation Indians and the English, but this is a relationship often built on misunderstanding and cultural clashes. From the poem Before You Are Mine, I chose the example of synesthesia. "I see you clear as scent under the tree." Now, clear as scent deliberately mixes the senses. That's what we call synesthesia. And it shows us how a familiar smell can trigger a most vivid recollection. It's one of the many vivid descriptions of a moment from a possessive child looking at her mother. And it's a great quotation for that poem. Sonnet 29, "I think of thee," I chose "Put out broad leaves and soon there's naught to see." This is a great quotation because this poem follows the Petrarchan sonnet form. And with all of these points that I'm making today, they are fully explained in the individual poem analyses. So if you listen and think, what? Go and watch the individual poetry analysis in the playlist. But basically, this poem follows the Petrarchan sonnet form, but there are some notable differences. The poem is set in iambic pentameter, but occasionally breaks this convention. For example, in this line, "Put out broad leaves and soon there's naught to see." In this line, the words out, broad and leaves are all stressed. And what is happening here is Barrett Browning is suggesting how powerful and intense her thoughts are at this moment. The poet is deliberately playing with the form of the Petrarchan sonnet to express her feelings about the intensity of love, which is what the whole poem is about. Her love is so overwhelming, it's causing her to lose control not just of herself, but of her use of poetic form. In Porphyria's Lover, "The sullen wind tore the elm tops down for spite." And you'll see the ... the ellipsis. This is actually one of a bit of a line, and then I've missed a bit of the line and carried on the sentence here. This again is personification of the weather to point out the speaker was already in a terrible mood. The description of the wind as sullen, tearing down the trees with spite, and later we see trying to vex the lake. Well, it paints the speaker as an irrational person. It's another example of pathetic fallacy, which we see so much of in these love and relationships poem, where the setting reflects the mood of the speaker. And structurally, it's really interesting because if you remember from my analysis, this is how the speaker felt before Porphyria enters. And when Porphyria arrives, we have the angelic language of "when glided in Porphyria," which shows a shift when she comes in. Mother any distance, unreeling years between us, anchor, kite. So there's some structural contrast here. There's a lot of enjambment between, even here, unreeling years between us. But then that's juxtaposed, that's contrasted with the blunt anchor, full stop, kite, full stop. Now these words, metaphorically as metaphors, they symbolize being held back, but the sentence structure also reflects the conflict between the mother and the son, anchor and kite. Both of those bring stability but also hold you in one place. So it's a structural point and a language point together, which makes this a great quotation to memorize. Neutral tones. We stood by a pond that winter day and the sun was white. Well, there's more pathetic fallacy. The sun, which we would usually expect to be yellow, is described as being white. And this is one of the many examples in the poem of a colourless scene. The description is almost entirely visual, but the colours themselves are bland, such as white and grey. And the lack of colour in the landscape reflects the lack of life in the relationship that's being described. But also, this is a great quotation because it's the first part of the poem, and it reminds us of the cyclical structure. It begins by a pond in the first stanza and ends by the pond in the final stanza. And by ending up where he began, there's no sense of closure. He's fated to never leave the sort of moment being described. It's a cyclical, inescapable structure. For Eden Rock, I chose the quotation, "Her hair, the colour of wheat, takes on light." Two things I think interesting here. The angelic description, the light shining through her hair is almost like a halo. It's one of many examples of sort of religious and sort of angelic language. And of course, the great thing about this poem is we don't need to memorize the quotation Eden Rock, which is not just the title, but it also appears in the poem, and it's another example of religious symbolism. So there's a lot of this religious language to reflect the sort of perfection, idyllic nature of the relationship between parent and child. Also, though, the use of wheat is one of many examples of nature imagery in the poem. We have rock, straw, grass, wheat, light, sky, sun, stream, stone, bank, as in riverbank. And all of these images are examples of nature and beauty. They reflect the natural and beautiful love between the parents and the speaker. Now, what I'm trying to do here is explain these quotations to you, but also link them out to other quotations, because if you can choose one example and sort of just reference how those things happen throughout the poem, that's really, really good. In "When we two parted, pale grew thy cheek and cold." So "when we two parted" is an example of accentual verse, which means that each line must contain the same amount of stressed syllables, no matter how many syllables there are in each line. So "when we two parted in silence and tears, half broken hearted to sever for years, colder thy kiss, sorrow to this." There are 2 stressed syllables per line, even though the lines themselves have anywhere between 4 and 6 syllables. But the stressed syllable count remains at 2 in those lines. Then we look at this line, line 5, "Pale grew thy cheek and cold," which breaks the rules of accentuated verse, containing 3 stressed syllables. And Byron is breaking the rules of structure to make an important point. The moment he breaks the rules of accentuated verse is with "Pale grew thy cheek and cold," which describes the moment when the poet was rejected by his lover. So the woman who he loved was turning cold on him. The action made the poet feel broken and rejected. Thus the poem's structure is broken too. Absolutely fantastic, sophisticated analysis. And again, I go through all of that in the analysis of the poem in the video. Walking away, I've got the biblical imagery of saying what God alone could perfectly show. We see this in the final stanza, a reference to God sacrificing his son Jesus, and the whole kind of Bible imagery. John 3:16, God so loved the world, he gave his one and only son. And the idea here is that it is hard to give up to let go in a relationship, to, as the title says, to walk away, but it is the right, it is the godly, holy, sanctified thing to do. In Follower, my father worked with a horse plough, his shoulders globed. This is an extended metaphor which we find throughout the poem related to the imagery of sailing. His shoulders globed like a full sail strung is the rest of the line, and it's an introduction to the metaphor. But there are lots of examples. The sod rolled over without breaking is similar to the rolling of a wave. Lots of examples of this sort of sailing imagery, and this is just one of them. Now, on a simple literal level, we could say, well, the skilled ploughing is visibly similar to the smooth motion of sailing, cutting through soil like a ship cuts through the water. But the metaphors also point to the highly skilled role of the father. Managing a plough with such skill is like mastering a ship. It's a highly skilled job. The imagery also represents how important the father is. He is the ship with the sails clinging to him, and the captain sailing through the soil. The father is everything to the boy, and these majestic images stand in stark contrast to those describing the boy himself, who's always tripping, falling and stumbling. Letters from Yorkshire, one of my favourite quotations in the entire collection, pouring air and light into an envelope, a lovely metaphor. Certainly a positive image. The speaker, we know, works indoors on a computer, so the air would bring freshness and refreshing to her existence. Light also has positive connotations, as we've talked about before, especially when coupled with the religious language of soul. And when I was in touch with the poet, she explained how this image is about being connected in a spiritual way. So it's a beautiful, vivid and creative image. In The Farmer's Bride, like the shut of a winter's day, a simile here with links to nature, like many of the quotations I've gone through, symbolising the state of the relationship between the husband and his bride, the wintry state, the sort of storm, the kind of cold state, the bad situation that it's in, which is very similar to winter swans. The clouds had given their all 2 days of rain. The negative aspects of the relationship are presented through pathetic fallacy, where the setting reflects the characters' moods. The clouds, 2 days of rain, symbolise the state of the couple's relationship. Things are not good, just like the weather. Not only is there pathetic fallacy, but also personification, where human attributes are given to something not human. In this case, the clouds had given their all, suggests the clouds had been deliberately attacking the couple, and reflects a downtrodden victim mentality of the speaker, who's in an incredibly negative mood, feeling like everything is against him. And of course, the title itself is Pathetic Fallacy, the winter, again reflecting the harsh, unappealing conditions of the relationship, just like The Farmer's Bride, and its mention to winter. In Climbing My Grandfather, I've chosen smooth and thick like warm ice. One of the most notable uses of language in the poem, a simile that is oxymoronic. It contradicts itself because something cannot be warm and ice at the same time. And the image is open to interpretation, but it perhaps suggests that there's a difference between how something looks and how it feels. It looks like ice, but it's warm, perhaps, which could possibly suggest the speaker had preconceived ideas about his grandfather, but the exploration of him has changed that, and the relationship has changed during the process. Those are the quotations I chose and why I chose them. I really like the fact that there's a great rhyme pattern throughout the quotations, so you can listen to the rap, and I'm sure if you listen to it a few times you'll remember all 15 quotations, or you can just take down the lyrics and put it to music yourself. But please do subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up. As you can imagine, this was the result of a lot of hard work, and I really do hope that it helps you to memorize 15 quotations, and you can apply the same thing if you want to learn another 15 too.